Hello everyone, this is the first lecture of week 3. We're going to be focusing a little bit on Puritan poetry, give you some context for your reading of Anne Bradstreet, Edward Taylor, and Michael Wigglesworth. First off, I think it's important to point out the place that poetry had in the lives of Puritans. Poetry at the time, of course, it was the primary literary genre. If you were a great writer, you were a poet. Being a great poet was something to strive for. The way that maybe today the best writers write novels or write screenplays, in that day, the best writers, to be considered one of the best writers, you had to be a poet. And as a result, the Puritans were kind of suspicious of poetry and felt that poetry was very worldly. Cotton Mather writes in a quote that I have in the PowerPoint slides, "The powers of darkness have a library among us, whereof poets have been the most numerous as well as the most venomous authors." So most poetry, at least the poetry that was popular and considered the best of that time, the British poetry, and if you've taken British literature, think John Donne, Alexander Pope, people of that era, were suspicious of poetry. It was something that was worldly. That doesn't mean that poetry wasn't important to them. Poetry was very important. It was a learning tool. It was a teaching tool. But they really only wanted poetry that was going to be helpful to them in leading holy lives and leading pious lives. And as a result, they really placed limits on imaginative literature. Fiction was, for the most part, frowned upon. Sort of flights of fancy, elaborate poetry was frowned upon. Mythical, classical allusions to the Greek myths or stories of knights and damsels and chivalry, all those things were frowned upon. Really, if you're going to write acceptable poetry and popular poetry amongst the Puritans, you would be writing about religious themes. And we can see that the poetry that was most popular among Puritans were the poets and the poetry that focused on teaching themes. The New England Primer is a great example. Is written for to teach children to read, to make good literate Puritans, and it focuses on very simple poetry. The poetry of Michael Wigglesworth, "The Day of Doom," was the most popular poem of the Puritan era. Focuses on the Day of Judgment, and it's a description of what's going to happen on the Day of Judgment. A very realistic, plain, straightforward description of what's going to happen. It's long. It's a bit on the dull side, I would think, for those of us who are used to horror movies and things like that. But at the time, it was very scary. It was something that they would read around the fireside together. They would read by lamplight as for entertainment, really. And, I want you to read, I think I picked out a few of the stanzas, maybe the first 20 or so stanzas of Day of Doom for you to look at to get a sense of the flavor of what popular Puritan poetry was at the time. But when critics and literary historians look back on the Puritan era, mainly we look back at two poets. One who was published at that time and was fairly well known, and one who was not. And those are Anne Bradstreet and Edward Taylor. Their poetic styles are very different, although their subject matter is somewhat similar. It's about their lives, it's about their families, it's about what they've experienced, sort of the common experiences of the Puritans who really are living kind of a rugged lifestyle. We don't really think about sort of the Massachusetts Bay Puritans as roughing it, but really a lot of them were. Edward Taylor was basically a frontier preacher. He was out on the westernmost part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and, preaching in settlements that were attacked by natives on a regular basis. And he writes this private poetry that is beautiful, that is artful, that is cognizant of the literary styles of England, and also very personal to him and his experiences. You'll read Upon Wedlock and Death of Children, for instance, which is based on his own life. It's what he went through, marrying and his children dying young, and sort of facing what that means to them and to him personally as a man, not just as a pastor, but as a man. And Anne Bradstreet, who uses a lot of classical allusions, is very intellectual and intelligent, but also writes very passionately about her relationship with her husband, about her love for her children. And I think these are important things to read, to let us know what these Puritans' lives were like, that they weren't just the surface of the people like Cotton Mather and sort of the pious, black-hatted pilgrims that we think of when we think of the Puritans. That these were real people, real living people who had deep thoughts, who had passions, who had concerns and worries, and above all, were worried about the people around them, about their families, about their loved ones. Anne Bradstreet, who you'll read first, she's extremely significant in American literary history because she is the first major female poet in America, and one of the first major female poets in the English language, as a matter of fact, as far as someone who was broadly read and published. She wrote her first volume of poems in America. It was originally published in England, but it was also the first book of poems by a woman printed in America, the American printing, which I believe I have a link to on the D2L site. She is writing about her own experiences, her own life, her family, her husband, the daily life that she lives and the things that she's concerned about and worried about. And I think it's interesting to note in her writing, there's a mix of what we would consider sort of classical poetry. She is definitely writing in the vein of Shakespeare and Sir Philip Sidney, but that mixes with this sort of Puritan worldview as well. That's very concerned with demonstrating that she is submissive and subordinate to both the will of God and also her husband and her family. An extremely intelligent woman, writing in a style that is on par with the greatest British poets of that time. Edward Taylor, who's writing a little bit later and comes to the Massachusetts Bay Colony later, writes in a style that is very much in the metaphysical style, like John Donne, where they take an idea, a metaphor, and they expand upon that, and that becomes central to the poem. A great example of that, of course, is Upon Wedlock and Death of Children, where he describes the marriage as the development of the garden and the children or the flowers coming out of the garden. His poetry is beautiful and detailed, and something that he used, obviously, personally to help him get through some very difficult times in his life. And many of his poems are meditations that are in preparation for sermons and things like that, but the poems that you're going to look at are sort of artfully constructed small poems that develop around a particular theme, and I think are particularly interesting. And they are going to be a little bit more difficult to read than some of the prose that you've read so far, and poetry usually is. And I would recommend that you read it a couple of times and look up any words that aren't clear to you and that you don't understand. And then if you do have questions, please post them on the discussion board, and I'll be more than happy to discuss any of the poems with you in this unit.